I'm Claire Bennett, 31 years old. And the moment I realized my mother had never booked a room for me on our family trip, I was standing in the middle of a bright hotel lobby with my suitcase in one hand and every pair of eyes slowly turning in my direction. The woman at the front desk kept apologizing, tapping the keyboard again and again, like the reservation might magically appear if she searched hard enough. It didn't. My mother stood a few feet away, silent, pretending to be distracted by the ocean view through the glass. My sister, on the other hand, had no problem saying exactly what everyone was supposed to hear. She looked me up and down, smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment, and said a failure didn't deserve to travel with this family. Not a room, not a seat at dinner, not even the basic courtesy of being treated like I belonged there. And the worst part was none of them looked surprised. That was when I understood this hadn't been some last-minute mistake or booking error. It had been planned. I had been invited just far enough to be humiliated in public. The strange thing is I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even raise my voice. I just looked at her, then at my mother, and said, "Then I'll leave." The silence that followed felt so sharp it could cut glass. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped me. But the second I turned and walked out of that hotel, something shifted. Because what they thought was the moment they finally put me in my place was actually the moment everything they had built started to come apart. Before I tell you what happened after I walked out of that lobby, tell me this. Have you ever had a family member smile in your face while setting you up to be humiliated? And if you have, where are you watching from today? I had seen the message 2 days earlier and almost ignored the knot it put in my stomach. My mother had sent a cheerful little confirmation text with the flight details, the resort address, and a note telling everyone to be downstairs by 6 for Thanksgiving dinner. But when I looked at the room list, I saw one room under my uncle's name, one under my mother's, and one under my sister and her husband's. Mine wasn't there. I stared at the screen for a full minute, then texted back, "I don't see my room." My mother replied 10 minutes later with, "The hotel is still sorting a few details. Just come." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just come. A younger version of me would have pushed harder. A younger version of me still believed that if something felt off, asking the right question could fix it. But after years of being treated like the family disappointment, I had learned how they worked. They always stayed vague when they were hiding something ugly. Even then, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. My uncle was the one paying for the trip. He had invited everyone. He believed in keeping the family together, even when the rest of us were barely pretending anymore. So, I packed my suitcase, boarded my flight from Austin, and tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. The moment I stepped into that hotel lobby, though, I knew I wasn't. The front desk clerk looked confused before she looked embarrassed. She kept clicking through screens, lowering her voice, then glancing up at me with that careful expression people use when they know bad news is about to land. I could feel my mother nearby before I even turned and saw her. She was standing close enough to hear every word, but not close enough to be forced into helping me. Then my sister walked over from the pool bar, holding a drink and smiling like she had spent all morning waiting for the show to begin. She didn't even pretend there had been a misunderstanding. She said, "Yeah? We didn't book one for you." Then she laughed softly and added that a failure didn't deserve to travel with this family anyway. The word failure hit the air harder than I expected, not because it was new. I had heard versions of it for years. I was the daughter who quit the respectable path, the sister who didn't marry well, the woman who lived in a small apartment and paid her bills one client invoice at a time instead of posting curated brunches and anniversary trips online. But hearing it there in public while my mother said nothing and strangers pretended not to listen made something inside me go very still. That was the moment I stopped trying to understand them. I picked up my suitcase, looked at my mother, looked at my sister, and said, "Then I'll leave." My sister's smile flickered for the first time. Maybe she had expected tears. Maybe she had expected me to beg for a room or accuse her in front of everyone. Instead, I gave her something colder. I gave her nothing. I turned and walked out through the glass doors into the warm Florida air. And behind me, the lobby went silent in a way that felt almost holy. What I didn't know yet was that someone else had heard every word from the second-floor balcony above us. And by the time I reached the curb, the real Thanksgiving story had already begun. I booked a ride to the airport before I even reached the driveway. Holiday flights were ridiculously expensive, but I didn't care. My peace had already cost me more than a plane ticket over the years. I sat on a bench near the entrance, suitcase by my legs, phone in my hand, and watched families step out of black SUVs wearing soft resort clothes and easy smiles. Everybody looked like they belonged somewhere. That used to hurt me more than I ever admitted. Not that day. That day, I felt strangely clear, like humiliation had burned the fog off everything. My phone buzzed just as my driver pulled up on the app. It was my uncle. I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't love him, but because I was suddenly too tired to explain myself to anyone. Still, I picked up. "Claire, where are you?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made me sit straighter. "I'm outside. I'm heading back to the airport," I said. There was a brief pause. Then he said, "Stay where you are." I saw what happened. I looked up at the hotel instinctively, my eyes tracking the balconies and polished railings above the lobby windows. He had been upstairs on a business call. He told me later, wrapping it up before coming down to meet everyone for lunch. From there, he had seen me at the desk, seen my mother standing back, seen my sister approach, and heard enough of the conversation to know this wasn't some clerical mistake. He came outside less than 3 minutes later, still in the linen blazer he wore when he wanted to look relaxed and successful at the same time. He sat beside me on the bench, without saying much at first. He didn't ask if I was okay in that soft, useless way people often do when they want credit for caring. He asked one thing. "Tell me exactly what she said." So I told him every word. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't cry. I didn't edit my mother's silence into something kinder than it had been. When I finished, he looked out at the road for a long moment and exhaled slowly. Then he said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. People who build their whole image on borrowed money always panic in front of someone who still has dignity without it. I turned toward him, but he was still staring ahead. "I'm sorry," I said, because I knew he had wanted this trip to feel like family. He finally looked at me then. "Don't apologize for someone else's cruelty," he said. Then he pulled out his phone, made 2 calls, and changed the course of the next 48 hours with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. First, he booked me a room at the same resort on the same floor as the others. Then, he asked me to come to Thanksgiving dinner the next evening, exactly as planned. I told him I didn't want a confrontation. He gave me the faintest smile and said, "Good. Neither do I." What he wanted, I realized, was something much worse for the people who had humiliated me. He wanted consequences. By the time I checked into my room that evening, my phone had already started lighting up. My mother called twice. My sister sent a text that said, "Are you seriously trying to make this a bigger deal than it is?" I stared at that sentence for a while, then locked my phone and set it face down on the nightstand. Across the hall, my family was probably still telling themselves the same old story, that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too unfinished to matter. The next night, they were going to learn what happened when the person they dismissed stopped trying to earn a place at their table. Thanksgiving dinner was held in one of the resort's private dining rooms overlooking the water. The kind of place built for expensive family photos and fake gratitude. Long candles flickered down the center of the table. Crystal glasses caught the light. There were folded place cards, polished silver, and a pianist somewhere in the background, making everything feel even more staged. My sister arrived dressed like she was headed to a magazine shoot. Her husband looked tense in that polished way men do when they know something is wrong, but still hope money will handle it. My mother greeted me with a stiff nod, the kind you might give a coworker you didn't like, but couldn't openly insult in public. No one mentioned the lobby. No one apologized. They acted as if the entire thing had simply dissolved because I had shown up anyway. I almost admired the audacity. Dinner moved along under a layer of fake normal. Wine was poured. Small talk floated around the table. My sister complimented the appetizers too loudly. My mother asked my uncle whether he had seen a certain oceanfront property nearby, already slipping back into the tone she used whenever she wanted to sound like a woman living a bigger life than the one she could actually afford. Then, right after the main course was served, my uncle set down his fork, dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and stood. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't ask for attention. He simply rose to his feet, and the room changed around him. "I have supported this family for a long time," he said, his voice calm and level. "Longer than most of you will ever admit out loud. My sister froze with one hand around her wine glass. My mother's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I stayed still. He continued. I paid for this trip because I believed the least we owed each other was basic decency. Instead, I watched one member of this family be humiliated in a hotel lobby over a room that should have been waiting for her all along. He turned and looked directly at my sister. She opened her mouth, probably to say she had been joking or misunderstood or pushed too far by stress. He stopped her with a glance. No. He said, you were not joking. You were performing status at someone else's expense. The silence after that was so complete I could hear cutlery clink in the kitchen outside the door. Then he reached into his jacket, took out a folded paper, and said, since clarity seems overdue, let me be clear. Effective immediately, all discretionary financial support I have been providing to this family ends today. My mother whispered his name like a warning. He ignored her. Monthly transfers stop. The supplemental tuition payments for your daughter's private school stop. The housing assistance arrangement I agreed to back in 2021 will not be renewed or extended in any form. If you want our lifestyle to continue, you may fund it yourselves. My sister went white so fast it was almost shocking. Her husband finally spoke, but his voice cracked on the first word. Sir, maybe we should discuss this privately. My uncle looked at him without blinking. Was her treatment of Claire private? He asked. Or was it public enough for the hotel staff and half the lobby to hear? That shut him up. My mother tried next. She leaned forward and said in a tight, shaking voice, this is extreme. It was a misunderstanding. No, my uncle replied. A misunderstanding is when truth gets lost. Yesterday I heard the truth very clearly. Then he said the one thing that truly broke the illusion. The people at this table have confused support with entitlement for years. Worse, you have mistaken borrowed comfort for personal superiority. You look down on the only person here who knows how to stand on her own feet. My sister started crying then, but not in a way that made anyone feel sorry for her. It was the panicked crying of someone watching the floor disappear under a life she thought was permanent. Her husband was staring down at his plate, like numbers were already racing through his head. My mother looked older in that moment than I had ever seen her. As for me, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there and felt something I hadn't felt around my family in years. I felt untouchable. My uncle folded the paper, put it back in his pocket, and sat down. Then he lifted his glass and said, Happy Thanksgiving. Nobody touched dessert. The first call came the next morning before I had even finished my coffee. It was my mother. I let it ring out, and she called again. Then my sister called. Then her husband. By noon, I had 11 missed calls and 6 texts, all of them circling the same message in different forms. Fix this. Talk to him. Tell him he overreacted. My sister's version was the most revealing. She texted, I cannot believe you sat there and let him do that to us. I read it twice and almost laughed. Let him do that to us. Not. I can't believe I said what I said. Not. I'm sorry for humiliating you. Just raw outrage that the consequences had arrived faster than she expected. By the time I flew back to Austin the next day, the full shape of the damage had started to surface. My uncle had never been a man who made empty threats. The monthly money stopped. The extra tuition payment stopped. More importantly, the backup financial support he had quietly provided during their home purchase years earlier was no longer available to reassure the bank if things got tight. Suddenly, the house my sister had flaunted online looked less like proof of success and more like a very expensive trap. Her husband emailed me 4 days later. It was the first honest thing anyone in that branch of the family had sent me in years. He wrote that they were in trouble. He wrote that they had structured too much of their life around money they had started treating as permanent. He wrote that my sister was panicking and that the bank had begun asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He ended by asking whether I thought my uncle would reconsider if enough time passed. I didn't respond. My mother tried a different strategy. First, she called angry, accusing me of turning my uncle against the family. Then, when that failed, she called sad. She cried into the phone and said my sister wasn't sleeping, that her daughter was confused, that the stress was putting pressure on everyone. Listening to her was like hearing someone describe a house fire while refusing to mention the match. Finally, I said, I didn't do this. She answered with a silence that told me she knew I was right and hated me for being right more than she had ever hated me for being a so-called failure. 2 weeks later, I learned my niece was being pulled from private school at the end of the term. The monthly payment had been one of the many beautiful lies holding that image together. My sister's social media went quiet almost overnight. No more brunch photos. No more smiling holiday reels. No more captions about gratitude and blessings and family. It was strange how quickly luxury disappeared when it had never really belonged to the person displaying it. My mother left me a voicemail late one Friday that I still remember almost word for word. "Natalie is falling apart, Claire. Please, if not for me, then for the little girl." I listened to it sitting at my kitchen counter after finishing a client revision. And for a brief second, I felt the old reflex rise in me. That old trained instinct to rescue, smooth things over, be the easier daughter, the quieter sister, the one who swallowed the insult so everyone else could keep calling themselves close. Then I thought about the lobby. I thought about the front desk clerk lowering her eyes. I thought about my mother saying nothing while my sister declared I didn't deserve a room, a dinner, a place. So, I called back and said the only true thing there was to say. "I can't fix something I didn't break." My mother inhaled sharply like she had been slapped. But I wasn't cruel. I was finished. And there is a difference. Over the next month, more cracks appeared. My sister and her husband started fighting openly enough that other relatives heard about it. The house might need to be refinanced, maybe sold. Credit card balances that had once looked manageable under the glow of constant support now looked terrifying under real light. Every update that reached me carried the same bitter lesson. It had never been wealth. It had been theater. And the audience had finally gone home. Winter in Austin is mild enough that you can forget other parts of the country are freezing. But that year, I felt the season anyway. Not in the weather, in the clarity. While my family was scrambling to explain their lives to creditors, schools, and each other, mine kept moving forward in the quiet, almost boring way stable lives usually do. I signed a long-term contract with a software startup that needed ongoing content strategy work. Another client expanded my role after a campaign performed better than expected. For the first time in a long time, my income stopped feeling like a cliff edge and started feeling like a structure. Not glamorous, not flashy, just real. I updated my spreadsheet one Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee beside me and realized I had crossed a number I used to daydream about hitting. Nobody applauded. Nobody posted it. Nobody knew except me. And somehow that made it feel even more solid. My uncle called a few times that winter, never to gossip, never to ask me to pick sides. He mostly asked about work, my apartment, whether I was sleeping enough, whether I had started thinking bigger about what I wanted next. One afternoon, he said, "You know what? Your sister never understood. She thought success was whatever made strangers envy you fastest." I let that sit between us. Then he added, "But real success is what still stands after the applause leaves." Around the same time, bits of news about my family kept filtering in. My niece had transferred to public school. My sister hated that more for the appearance of it than for the change itself, which told me she still had not fully learned the lesson. Her husband was trying to renegotiate their mortgage, or at least buy time. My mother had downsized and was now living in a smaller place with none of the easy comforts she used to treat as normal. Every now and then, she sent me awkward messages that circled around accountability without landing on it. Things like, "I see some things differently now," or, "Life has a way of humbling people." I noticed she still struggled to say the one sentence that mattered most. I was wrong. As for my sister, months passed before I heard directly from her. In that silence, I finally understood something I should have learned years earlier. The opposite of love in families is not always hatred. Sometimes it is usefulness. As long as they could use me as the less successful daughter, the cautionary tale, the one who made everyone else feel more complete, they kept me close enough to compare and far enough to dismiss. But the minute I refused the role, the entire balance shifted. They lost more than their money that Thanksgiving. They lost their mirror. And once that happened, they had no choice but to look at themselves. I wish I could say that realization made me sad. Mostly it made me free because the same family who had once treated me like proof of failure were now being forced into the kind of ordinary, accountable life I had been building all along. Paying attention to budgets. Making choices based on reality. living without a wealthy safety net to absorb every bad habit. They called that life embarrassing when it was mine. Suddenly, it was called maturity when it became theirs. That was almost funny. Almost. By early spring, I had started looking at flights again. Not because I needed to prove anything. Not because I wanted a dramatic full circle moment, just because I could. There is a special kind of peace in knowing you can leave, arrive, stay, or walk away on your own terms. I hadn't just survived that Thanksgiving. I had stepped out of a lie and into a life that finally felt like it belonged entirely to me. The message from my sister came on a Tuesday night while I was boiling pasta and listening to a podcast with one earbud in. It was not a call, which told me she still didn't trust herself to hear my voice. It was not an email either, which meant it had taken more courage than her polished formal messages usually did. It was a simple text. I've been thinking about what I said at the hotel. I know sorry doesn't undo it, but I've thought about it every day since. I stood there in my kitchen, wooden spoon in hand, reading those words while steam rose from the stove. Months earlier, I would have imagined that moment differently, bigger, sharper. Maybe I would have pictured myself writing back something perfect and devastating, something that cut with the same precision she had used on me. But revenge, I had learned, is not always at its most satisfying when it is loud. Sometimes the deepest revenge is letting people live long enough to understand exactly what they destroyed with their own hands. I typed one reply, I know. Then I put the phone down and finished making dinner. That was all. Not because what she did was small. Not because I had magically healed. And certainly not because one text restored trust that had been damaged over years, not minutes. I replied that way because I no longer needed her pain to prove my worth. She had already lost the stage she used to stand on. The life she bragged about had cracked. The image she weaponized against me had collapsed. And I was still here in my apartment in my own peace, cooking my own dinner, paying my own way, building something no one could take credit for and no one could yank out from under me. That was enough. Family relationships do not repair themselves because one person finally says sorry after consequences arrive. Real repair is slower than that. It takes truth. It takes changed behavior. It takes the humility to stop rewriting the past in a way that flatters the people who caused the damage. I did not know yet whether my sister was capable of that kind of change. I did not know whether my mother would ever fully admit what her silence had cost me. But for the first time in my life, I understood that I did not have to wait for them to become better people before allowing myself to feel whole. And that was the real ending they never saw coming. They thought power meant deciding who belonged, who got invited, who got a room, who deserved to sit at the table. But the truth is, people only have that kind of power over you as long as you keep begging them to use it kindly. The second you stop, the whole structure starts to rot from the inside. If there is one lesson in everything that happened, it is this. A family that measures human worth by money, image, marriage, or status will eventually destroy itself from the inside out. But a person who learns to live with dignity, discipline, and self-respect can survive even the cruelest rejection and come out stronger on the other side. That matters beyond one holiday or one argument. It matters in homes, in friendships, in the way we raise children, and in the values we reward as a community. If you teach people that appearances matter more than character, they will grow up performing instead of becoming. If you teach them that comfort is more important than accountability, they will collapse the first time life gets real. But if you teach them to stand on their own feet, to respect others even when they feel superior, and to never confuse financial dependence with personal value, you give them something far more lasting than luxury. You give them a foundation. My old gray suitcase still sits in the back of my closet. It is cheap, a little scratched, and nothing about it looks impressive. I love it for that because the last time I wheeled it through a hotel lobby, someone told me I didn't deserve to travel with the family. Next time I take it out, I'll be going somewhere I chose on a ticket I bought to a room no one can take from me. And that to me sounds a lot more like success than anything my sister ever posted.